George Washington's Concerns. George Washington Letter to Henry Lawrence, November 14, 1778, by George Washington. The American Revolution was more complex than American colonists' efforts to establish independence from Great Britain. The North American colonies were facing one of the greatest European powers. The Americans needed assistance because the Americans would not likely win the war without support from foreign powers. However, the colonies did not have an easy time obtaining that support, and the alliance with France was one of the most important diplomatic success of the Americans during the war. The Continental Congress created the Secret Committee of Correspondence, and Benjamin Franklin, a member, wrote to contacts in France with accounts of the American resistance, which is what the committee was for, to publicize the American cause in Europe. Benjamin Franklin then led a group of several commissioners to establish an alliance with France, after Congress formally declared independence in 1776. And the French Foreign Minister Comte de Vergennes saw an alliance with the Americans after news of the Declaration of Independence and the British evacuation of Boston reached France. When there was negative news, for instance George Washington's defeats in New York, Vergennes was in doubt about a full alliance. Franklin was well liked in France, and that aided in persuading Vergennes for an alliance. With the British surrender at Saratoga, Vergennes went for an alliance with the Americans, and on February 6, 1778, Benjamin Franklin, Silas Deane, and Arthur Lee signed a treaty of alliance and a treaty of amity and commerce with France. With the Treaty of Alliance, both countries could not make separate peace with Great Britain, and there was a clause where other European countries could enter the alliance, and Spain joined on June 21, 1779. Now, the American colonists obtained that crucial aid. The French helped the Continental Army with troops and naval support, arms and ammunition, uniforms, and supplies. However, George Washington was cautious of a second alternative from France in entering an alliance with the Americans. George Washington was the leader of the Continental Army and was a well-respected man, known for being humble. Even though the alliance with France was important to the Americans, Washington had some concerns. Washington wrote a private letter to Henry Lawrence, the new President of Congress, dated November 14, 1778. Here, Washington wrote how the conquest of Canada, which Major General Lafayette was chosen to lead, would benefit the French because the French would be able to rebuild a North American empire, and that would turn France into an oppressor to the Americans. Lafayette left Lafayette's family to serve in the American cause without pay. The French would be able to gain all of that territory and extract the supplies that the land provided. The French would also be able to conduct trade with the Indians in that territory. France would be able to construct ports on the continent, which would immensely help in trade. Additionally, France would have a strong navy and would be able to protect the islands the country controlled, and could also control the American states. The amount of people living in Canadian territory would protect the French Empire there from other powers invading Canada. The French control of Canada would greatly add on to the country's power, and France would have a large influence in North America. France engaged in the alliance for personal reasons. France would be helping American colonies gain independence, but at the same time would establish French power in North America once again. George Washington would know about countries fighting for personal gain. Washington fought in the French and Indian War, where Britain and France fought over the Ohio River Valley because both countries wanted to expand each sphere of influence. France also wanted to have revenge on Great Britain. The country viewed the British defeat at Saratoga as an opportunity to weaken Britain. Britain obtained all French territory east of the Mississippi River. Therefore, France would be resentful towards Great Britain. The Anglo-American colonists and the Iroquois Confederacy were against the French colonists with French native allies in the French and Indian War. Britain controlled the 13 colonies up to the Appalachian Mountains, and the colony of New France contained Louisiana through the Mississippi Valley and the Great Lakes to Canada in 1753. The Ohio River Valley was a disputed area between the unclear border of the British and French, and the French built multiple forts in that area. There, Lieutenant Colonel George Washington failed at driving out the French in 1754 when he fought as a British colonial force. At first, the British were not in favor for victory, but British forces conquered French forces in India, and the British invaded and conquered Canada as well. Now, the French were in a bad position and wanted peace with Great Britain, but the British minister William Pitt, Secretary for Southern Affairs, wanted France to give up Canada and wanted commercial concessions. King Charles III of Spain wanted to help King Louis XV of France, the Spanish king's cousin, and a family compact was the result where Spain would declare war on Great Britain if the war did not conclude before May 1st, 1762. Britain, however, declared war on Spain on January 4th, 1762, and the British were able to capture the Philippines, the French Caribbean islands, and Spanish Cuba. The British won with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, where Britain obtained all French territory east of the Mississippi River and Cuba was returned to Spain, but the British still got Florida. It is evident how the French considered the British to be their natural enemy. Britain had conquered all of that French territory. Therefore, Washington suspected that France wanted to have a strong presence in North America once more by placing French troops in Canada and wanted to rival Great Britain. In this excerpt, as for France being an oppressor to American states, Washington writes how the states would be surrounded by the French and France's allies. There would be a French presence in New Orleans to the Americans' right. The French would control Canada to the left. There would also be Native Americans who France could easily pacify because the Indians were on good terms with France. France would be able to manipulate these Native American tribes that could influence the American states. That could be dangerous for the Americans, especially now that France was a strong naval power, not to mention France's land power. And if Spain joined France, this European power would be even more powerful. France would definitely have a large influence on the North American continent. Washington was worried about the future independence for America, with the French having that much control of land and power. Additionally, America would not be powerful enough to defend America from the Indians or France should something spark hostilities between the two. Furthermore, according to this excerpt, Washington was afraid that France might hold Canada until the Americans paid the debt that was owed to France because of the aid that France provided the Americans with, and the Canadians would help in protecting that French-claimed territory. The American states would not have enough manpower to oppose the French. The alliance between France and the American states would probably not dissolve because of this, but the alliance would if the American states had a reunion with Great Britain. Even though a reunion with Britain would not aid the Americans, the French would be hostile and would be powerful enough to send as many French troops as needed to protect France's claims, and Britain would be too weak to oppose the French. However, people who supported the French because they abhorred the British would not likely think of this consequence that would accompany the Franco-American alliance. Therefore, France would not let go of French claims, and the French would be hostile towards the states. This would be even more dangerous with the French presence all around the Americans. Washington needed to warn that the conquest of Canada was the optimal opportunity for France to regain power in North America. George Washington wrote to Henry Lawrence about the dangers of the conquest of Canada with France to eliminate those plans, which would not have been done until 1779. And Henry Lawrence had the power to do so because he was the president of the Continental Congress. In this excerpt, George Washington wrote how he liked the French and knew that French aid was essential. However, Washington wanted to remind again that countries are driven by self-interest, and a politician or statesman will always have the country's best interests in mind. Washington also again reminded how the Americans should be cautious of France because if something happened, America would not be strong enough to protect America. Washington, too, was an example of a person who had the country's best interests in mind. In this case, Washington wanted to protect America from a strong French presence in North America. Additionally, Washington led an army to gain independence from Great Britain, which was another personal interest of the American colonies. George Washington's letter to Henry Lawrence, therefore, showed how ambitious countries could be.